Stevens. You know, this reminds me of the Nixon White House, with which I have some familiarity. So let's deal now, if we can, with where we stand in this campaign. Kamala Harris will be the nominee. Now, I should tell you that people asked me repeatedly, and I'm giving you this background just so you have a sense of where I was coming from, of whether or not there would be an open convention. I responded, there will not be an open convention, and I want you to understand why. The structure of American politics has changed. We have not had a person drafted since Adlai Stevenson in 1952, and prior to that, Wendell Willkie in 1940. In those days, conventions had uncommitted delegates. They had bosses who dictated how things would go. That doesn't exist within the nominating process. So there's another factor that everyone needs to understand. Let's assume for a moment that there is a vacancy on the ticket, either for president or vice president, for any number of reasons. You understand that there will not be a reconvened national convention. What there will be is a meeting of either the Democratic or the Republican national committees. And we have one example of this in recent history, and that was 1972, when Tom Eagleton withdrew as a candidate for vice president. George McGovern named the candidate he wanted running with him, but remember, it was a national committee who nominated Sergeant Shriver. If, for some reason, unforeseen, there were to be a vacancy either at the top or the bottom of the ticket, the central role would be filled by the National Committee. Now, most people don't know who the National Committee people are, and most people don't know who the chair of each respective party is. Frankly, it doesn't matter anymore, because essentially a candidate for president is in complete control of the party and the selection process. When we deal with the political party structure, we need to understand that it is not as it once was. And let me shift my focus just for a moment to the battle for the House and Senate. All of these battles are going to be critical, because whoever wins the presidency will want control of the Senate at a very minimum. The reason is because judicial nominations, which offers, and I will, in a subsequent talk to you, outline critical Senate races. And as we get closer to the election, when I'm able to review polls and hear what happens, I'll be able to observe about that with you as well. The House of Representatives, believe it or not, is up for grabs. And the Democrats and the Republicans both know it. So we have to watch that as well. So there are a lot of pieces in play, and this really is a crucial election. One of the things we know is that every election, we are told, this is the most important election in American history. May I tell you that in each case, that is precisely true. Those of you who have taken my courses on American presidents understand that who is president of the United States matters profoundly. Let me give you an example. Had Al Gore prevailed in 2000, the Chief Justice of the United States would not have been who we have now. It would have been Stephen Breyer, our own San Franciscan, and Shirley Breyer Black, who was a student here at the Fromm, used to remind me constantly that if only Gore had won, her nephew would have been the Chief Justice of the United States. So we are not just voting for a president and vice president. We are also voting for who the nominees, not only for the Supreme Court, but the lower courts, including the appellate courts, the district courts, who those people are going to be. And all of you understand how critical that is. Do I take what candidates for president say seriously? When in 2016, Donald Trump pledged that if he were elected president, the justices he would put on the Supreme Court would reverse Roe v. Wade. A lot of people dismissed that, and they dismissed it because they said, well, it's established law. And they couldn't imagine that there would be a reversal. And the simple truth is, Donald Trump told us precisely what he would do, and he did it. The three nominees that he selected all implemented precisely what Donald Trump wanted, but they wanted it as well. Once upon a time, it could be argued that justices of the court, and I'm speaking now just of the Supreme Court, were chosen based on merit. And you will note that we have had liberals and conservatives who have been presidents, and their selections have not been based on ideology as much as qualification. And that, by the way, includes Franklin Roosevelt with his attempted court packing in 1937. Although the court took a dramatic shift, he had both liberals and conservatives who he put on the court, and the man he elevated to be Chief Justice, Justice Stone, was a Republican who had been put on the court by Calvin Coolidge. Now, why am I saying this to you? Because when we look tonight, and I'm going to review debates in a few minutes, when we look tonight, we have to listen to those kinds of observations. What are they pledging to do? Last Sunday, I flew in from Los Angeles about 4. And by the way, anybody who tells you there is no climate change, we got off the plane at Hollywood Burbank. It was 116 degrees. When I got on the plane to come back to San Francisco, it was 106 degrees. And let me assure you, I understand what climate change means just from that singular experience. And I say this to you respectfully, but I want you to understand, we are blessed to live in San Francisco because we are still in an air-conditioned city. But I hope you read the observation that fog, so traditionally a part of our lives, it may not be a part of our lives. Well, I think in our lifetime will be okay, but for our children and grandchildren, probably not. So I raise this with you because I want you to understand there are a lot of issues which need to be addressed, for which, and listen carefully, for which there are no solutions. My father, who was a doctor, used to come home sometimes very upset. Why? Because he could diagnose a patient, but sometimes he couldn't cure the illness. And it upset him because he knew what had to be done, but he couldn't do it. And in the political world in which we live today, this is a problem. Now, I want to identify what I view as key campaign issues, which we will be discussing and which the candidates will be discussing. And my are saying we have to debate and discuss in this class. The first and foremost issue that I think we will confront in this campaign will be a woman's right to choose. I can guarantee you tonight, Kamala Harris will make it a centerpiece of what she does. I've talked to some of the people working with her in preparation, and I have no doubt that that is one of the critical issues. Why? Because there is a gender gap. Overwhelmingly, women in America are voting for Kamala Harris. Whether they agree with her on substantive issues or not, the question of a woman's reproductive rights is front and center in the campaign. And you will note, and I say this so we all understand it, that Donald Trump has been all over the map on this issue. At one point, Donald Trump was pro-choice. At one point, Donald Trump took very different positions than he takes now. But I participated in a discussion, which is up online, by the way, dealing with Project 2025. And I want to say a word about Project 2025. And I know I'm skipping a lot of things over and above, but I have to do this in order to cover it and leave you time for questions. Project 2025 was created by the Heritage Foundation. Let me remind you that most Americans became aware of the Heritage Foundation during the administration of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was a great promoter of the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation is a legitimate conservative think tank. When I wanted to understand what conservatives were thinking, I immediately went to that site. Now, let me describe to you a book that was written in 1975 after President Nixon left office. The author is Richard Nathan, and the book is called The Plot That Failed. I commend it to you because I believe it to be one of the most important books written in the post-Nixon presidency, and it describes precisely what is happening now. Richard Nathan outlined the position of the Nixon administration of wanting to establish, listen carefully, an administrative presidency. The consolidation of cabinet departments, the elimination of the Department of Education, among other things. But the most important single element was that the power of the presidency would formulate American policy. It failed not because they didn't have all the levers of power in place, but because of Richard Nixon's resignation as president, and because Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter and others were not in favor of that kind of presidential power. This issue of Project 2025 is going to be central in the debate tonight. I can guarantee you, and you, if you're watching the ads, and I may in one class, assuming we can set it up, use ads from Trump and Harris and let you watch them so we can analyze them together. At least that's my hope. I have to rely on the office for that. So let's see how that goes. But Project 2025 spells out an administrative presidency. Now, some people ask, how would that be implemented? May I assure you, and those of you who've taken my courses on the American presidency, that a president who has a real design, really knowing what they want to accomplish, can accomplish virtually anything by consolidating power. And you can be assured that if Donald Trump is elected president of the United States, or Kamala Harris is elected president, they are going to use every vehicle, every tool at their disposal to implement their policy. And by the way, yes, that means bypassing Congress. On occasion, you will see presidents who may have opposed presidential power. And the best example of that is Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson believed strongly in Congress and the power of Congress until he became president of the United States. And then Wilson also advocated a strong presidency. Some of you will go back and remember a book written by Arthur Schlesinger Jr., published in 1973, called The Imperial Presidency, which outlines the evolution of presidential power. Donald Trump and the people around him understand the use of presidential power. And we're going to see that, no doubt, from the time Donald Trump takes the oath of office for a second time. I also wanted to comment, if I can, concern. I mentioned it, I alluded to it, but I want you to understand. You better take a hard look at who the candidates for president rely on for legal advice. One of the most interesting aspects of this campaign are the people who work for Donald Trump who oppose him. And I want to pause for a moment and talk about Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney became a villain to most Americans during the Bush administration. Make no mistake, there was tremendous anger. Of course you can. I hope he does a better job than Rose Woods.
Say hi.
Hello. Is that better?
Thank you.
The same.
It's better for us online. Thank you, Professor.
Oh,
Thank you,
I'm
Herbert.
delighted. Thank you very much. The question which I posed, and which I think is so critical, is the power of the president. And I just want to remind you that when you are president of the United States, you have tremendous power and you want to exercise it. There is no doubt that both Trump and Harris will exercise that power fully. And that it means as well executive orders. Remember that if Congress is not united behind a president, that the president's ability to maneuver and to implement policy is much tougher. So I want you to be aware of that as well. Let me talk about the fact, and I was alluding to the Cheneys, and I want to say this very clearly. Dick Cheney was a villain in this class during the Bush years. Those of you who remember my discussion on the Middle East and foreign policy, which we did extensively, will remember that people didn't like Dick Cheney. But I want to remind everybody that Dick Cheney was chief of staff to Gerald Ford. He was a very effective chief of staff at the White House, and frankly, evaluations of his leadership in those days is quite remarkable. He went on to run for a House seat in Wyoming, and he rose to the number 3 position in the House of Representatives, Republicans. And had he not been tapped to become Secretary of Defense, he would have become Speaker of the House of Representatives. I commend to all of you a book written by Dick Cheney and his wife called Kings of the Hill. In reading that book, you will understand Dick Cheney's profound belief in the power of Congress, as well as in the importance of understanding history. Now, it's true that Dick Cheney was the Darth Vader, if you will, and we all remember James Earl Jones today, who passed away yesterday. So in mentioning that, every illusion should come into your mind. We remember that Dick Cheney played a critical role as vice president. In fact, if I were teaching a course on the vice presidency, I would tell you he was the most significant vice president in modern political history. He really was a partner to George Bush in the whole Iraq, Afghanistan situation. The Cheneys are Republicans. They are real conservative Republicans. They are mainline conservative Republicans. To have Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney, and Liz, I would remind you, was also the number 3 Republican in the House of Representatives. To have them decide to endorse Kamala Harris is a stunning reversal. Now, do endorsements matter? I'm covering a lot, but I want to do this. Some of you, nobody in this room is old enough to remember 1936. In 1936, Alf Landon was the Republican nominee for president, and Franklin D. Roosevelt was running for re-election. There was great dissatisfaction among conservative Democrats with Franklin Roosevelt. And so John W. Davis, who had been the Democratic candidate for president in 1924, endorsed Alf Landon. Alfred Emanuel Smith, the governor of New York, who was the Democratic candidate for president in 1928, endorsed Alf Landon for president. A series of Democratic called the Liberty League, fascinating organization, which was made up of conservative Democrats. They called themselves Jeffersonian Democrats. And the real bottom line is their vigorous fundraising, their vigorous activity to defeat Franklin Roosevelt went nowhere. You may recall that Roosevelt defeated Landon, carrying 46 of the 48 states. The old expression was, as Maine goes, so goes the nation, became as Maine goes, so goes Vermont. And so the question of endorsements, I'm always skeptical. The only endorsement I ever knew that really meant anything, those of you familiar with San Francisco politics, was Quentin Kopp, who is still alive and still kicking. When Quentin, even if you voted against Quentin, when he wrote a ballot argument, it generally made great sense. And if he endorsed something, it generally passed. And if he opposed it, it generally lost, because most people don't read ballot arguments, right? So in this presidential campaign, although the appreciation of this break in the Republican Party, what do the polls tell you today? The polls tell you there is a division in America that is almost even, 50-50, that there is no clear leader in this effort. And so that's why tonight will be so decisive. Now, let me describe some of the other policy issues, and I want to deal with foreign policy for just a moment. You all heard the news this morning, very disturbing news, that Iran is now providing ballistic missiles to Russia. Now, we announced today, that is Secretary Blinken announced today, more sanctions against Russia. And there is no doubt, and I want to make this clear because in the next 8 weeks this may unfold, that if ballistic missiles supplied by Iran are used in the Ukraine war, there will be a response from the West. I was in Europe 2 weeks ago. We were in, among other places, Estonia and in Poland. And I can tell you that the real concern about Ukraine, which we don't feel here, we don't understand, they understand it. And they are terrified that there may be a renewal of Russian aggression. So there is something that we have to understand in terms of foreign policy. The first thing is that J.D. Vance, the vice presidential nominee, opposes aid to Ukraine. How central will this be in this presidential campaign? And where does Donald Trump really stand, who says if he is elected president, he'll resolve the issue in 24 hours? No, you're laughing, but understand something. It's very serious because there is a real difference between Donald Trump and his view of what is going on in Ukraine and the view that we know of Kamala Harris, who supports American support for Ukraine. In the old days, in a presidential campaign, in a close presidential campaign, particularly in states like Ohio and Michigan, in the Midwest, where there are large Eastern European populations, this would have been a profoundly important issue. So far, it has not emerged. But let me assure you that the secondary issue is NATO. We were in Sweden. And in Sweden, which was a neutral country, particularly during World War II, although they leaned, frankly, toward Germany, Sweden now is a member of NATO. Finland is a member of NATO. One of Joe Biden's great accomplishments is the survival of NATO, but more than that, and he doesn't really deserve the credit, the fear of Putin and Russia caused Sweden and Finland to break their neutral stance and join NATO. Does Donald Trump favor the continuation of NATO? And let me tell you, many of you are saying no, but the answer is you're probably right, but he hasn't declared one way or the other, although key foreign policy figures in the Trump administration, including several former national security advisors, including several people who served as Secretary of State, leading Republican foreign policy advocates, are voting against. It was just. I saw it yesterday, but I can't know whether it was a buy or simply a repeat of 3 critical people in the Trump administration, including former Vice President Mike Pence, who have said they will not vote for Donald Trump. Not all of them are endorsing Harris, but they're opposing Trump. That brings me back to 1936, John W. Davis, Al Smith, John Jacob Raskin. When people in an administration or in a political party then publicly declare their opposition, and I listened to John Bolton, who's a very controversial figure. I've interviewed him several times. He said he was glad that his image and words were being used in the ad against Donald Trump. Now, will the Democrats mobilize on that question? Now, there's another serious foreign policy consideration, and that is the Middle East. There is no answer to what is happening in the Middle East. You will understand that it is an intractable problem, made more problematic by the fact that what is going on now is a multi-front war. It's Israel against Hamas in Gaza. The real concern that everybody has, by the way, and which may emerge and which we may have to talk about in this class, will be if there is an attack by Hezbollah on Israel in the north. Are you aware that 100,000 Israelis have been driven from their homes in the north? This is no joke. And it is Michael Oren, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, who is now coming to Washington. He's just written a book about this, and he says the real question will be Hezbollah and the question of those arms. We have the Houthis in South Yemen, and let me be clear about what is going on there. because it has to do with waterways. It has to do with preventing shipments of oil and goods through the Red Sea. Their attitudes, the Houthi rebels, critical. Number 4, of course, is Iran, who remains highly problematic, and which I've just mentioned to you in terms of the selling of ballistic missiles to Russia to be used in the Ukraine war. I point these things out because all of these foreign policy issues, which are not front and center, are going to be critical. Richard Nixon once said to me that 70% of a president's time is really absorbed in foreign policy. Who is commander in chief matters. Let me boil it down very simply. If our position on Ukraine changes, Zelensky and the Ukrainians are finished. They will be unable to prevent Russian aggression. If Kamala Harris is elected president, the Ukrainians have a fighting chance, not of winning a war, but at least establishing themselves so strongly that they can't be defeated. And who is president matters, because, ladies and gentlemen, that policy is not made by Congress. That policy is made by the President of the United States, who I would remind you is Commander in Chief of the Armed Forces. I say this respectfully. I don't know how it will emerge on the debate stage. By the way, it's not really a debate, it's a joint appearance. Now I'll get to that in a moment. Let me also point out to you in terms of foreign policy that China is of greater and greater concern. You understand that the Chinese aggression in the South China Sea has created an alliance between Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Taiwan, all vitally concerned with China's expansionist views. There are a lot of people who understand very clearly that what happens in Asia is going to be critical. By the way, the Philippines, I should have included the Philippines in that. They are really, and South Koreans. We haven't get into North Korea and the problems there, although you remember the love letter between Trump and, anyway. So I'm explaining this to you because I want you to understand, as we begin in a moment the discussion about the debate or the joint appearance, is there are a multitude of issues, but I want to emphasize this with clarity and precision. The most important single thing will be who is president of the United States on January 20th, because the nature of our policies will change. I want to make one other quick comment, and that's about global warming. It was tolerable. And I can only tell you there is no immediate solution to global warming. But when you talk about climate and you talk about shifts of population and rising sea levels, which is something we heard about repeatedly on this trip, this will be a central question. It's not solvable, do you understand? But I would remind you that one of the things that Kamala Harris will emphasize is that Donald Trump took us out of the Paris Accords. Whether you agree or disagree with the Paris Accords, the simple fact is the people around Donald Trump do not believe global warming is real. Or if they believe it's real, it's not man-made. And it becomes a struggle for how to identify ways of resolving that issue. Now, I could go on and on foreign policy, and it's worth doing in a way, but I hate the clock. But let me now move to the debate, and I apologize for all the things I'm leaving out. And let me talk about debates in general. What will I be looking for tonight? And by the way, I'm a radio person. I was commenting to Derek, this is the first time since 1976 that I have not been on the radio doing a running commentary on the debate. Believe me, talk about frustration. So you guys are going to be my psychiatrist, because I will be able to reveal everything to you, and I'll feel much better, I know that. Let's do a quick review of debates, please. Remember that tonight Donald Trump and Kamala Harris will meet in person for the first time. Did you hear me? For the first time. They have never met face to face or interacted before. What happens on a debate stage is critical. You may remember, and I want to give you some history, the first debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Nixon had banged his knee, had been in the hospital, had lost 30 pounds. He wore a shirt where the collar size was absolutely terrible. He wore a white shirt, a gray suit against that kind of white background. And he looked god awful. His mother called Rose Woods and asked, "Is Richard all right?" He wasn't. He was running a fever. He was in pain because he banged his knee again coming into the debate in Chicago, getting out of the car. For Nixon, it was an unmitigated disaster. Now, if you listened to that debate on the radio, as I did, Nixon won. He won on argument. He won on points. But what will be the most important and telling thing tonight, it's why if I were on the radio, I would tell you not to listen to it on the radio, but turn on your television. It's how you look. That's what's important. And much of the defining moment is based on appearance. In the second debate between Nixon and Kennedy, Nixon looked better and he scored very well, but Nixon believed that the majority of people would listen to the last debate. There were 4 of them. It turned out a majority of people listened to the first debate. That's what they watched. And so when in the 4th debate, Nixon really scored a TKO against Kennedy, it was too late. The damage was done. Now, I also want to indicate to you that in the Ford-Carter debate, remember there was no debate in 1964 between Goldwater and Johnson, no debate in 68 between Nixon and Humphrey and Wallace, no debate in 72 between Nixon and McGovern. So the first time we had a real debate, again, was Ford and Carter. And you will remember, because, well, one of those debates was held right here in San Francisco at the Palace of Fine Arts. You will remember that Gerald Ford made a fatal error. Nominated. He didn't. And I would tell you that was a fatal moment for Gerald Ford's presidential candidacy. And you will also remember how one line can make a difference. There was only one debate between Reagan and Carter. There was another debate between Reagan and John Anderson, who was a third-party candidate for president, but nobody paid any attention. But do you remember Reagan in 1980 asking a question which is still asked repeatedly in American politics? Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And trust me, Donald Trump will use that line. I am convinced, because their argument is that we, the American people, were better off under Donald Trump. You'll recall in 1984, when Mondale and Reagan stood on the same stage, that in the first debate, there were 2 of them. In the first debate, Mondale won. He won decisively. Because if you remember, Ronald Reagan in his closing argument trailed off. He lost his train of thought. He was not clear and decisive. And I can tell you, I knew the Mondale people in those days very well. They believed they had a real chance of beating Reagan if in the second debate he did the same kind of performance. But do you remember what Ronald Reagan did? One line. He turned to Walter Mondale and he said, "I will not hold my opponent's age and inexperience against the youth and inexperience against him." And do you remember what happened? Mondale laughed. The whole audience laughed. And that was it. Reagan won and nailed a re-election victory. In 1988, if you remember, after the Democratic National Convention, when conventions meant something, Michael Dukakis was 19 points ahead of George H.W. Bush. And you remember what happened? He was asked by Bernard Shaw, what if Kitty Dukakis were raped? If his wife was raped, would he then favor the death penalty? And you remember that fumbled answer? I mean, if you go back and you listen to it, Dukakis stated why he was against the death penalty. But that's not what people wanted to hear. They wanted to hear indignation. If my wife were raped, I'd nail the son of a, you know, an emotional reaction. And that's when Dukakis lost his chance to be president. And may I tell you, in 1992, in one of those moments which remains indelibly engraved, it was not words, it was an action. George H.W. Bush looked at his watch. Now, I'm pointing these things out, and I can go through all the debates, but I can see if I do that, I'll have you here till 3 o'clock this afternoon. What I wanted to demonstrate to you is that a moment in a debate or joint appearance is critical. I want to point something else out to you. In 1960, the first confrontation between Nixon and Kennedy was a general discussion. The last debate was on foreign policy. There were particular focuses in each one of these joint appearances in which the candidates had to address particular issues. That does not exist in this campaign. I know we will have a debate tonight, but I can't guarantee there'll be another one. And so the images, but most important, the mistakes that are made are what will be emphasized. People do not look for the affirmative that come out of these discussions. The question will be, who makes the biggest mistake? So tonight, I'll be listening and watching. I'll be waiting for the mistake, because the mistake is what will be played and replayed over and over again. Now, I can't guarantee what will happen tonight. You all have been listening to the strategies proposed. I listen to Fox because I want to hear what the right of center is saying. I listen to MSNBC to get the left of center position. I listen to CNN selectively because I know where the reporters stand on their issue. Night, and they were pro-Harris. Now, here's the kicker. Part of my time on vacation was a cruise through the Baltics, through the Baltic Sea. And I want you to know, I will never forgive my wife for forcing me to go on a cruise during the Democratic National Convention. I want it on the record. Now, you might wonder, what did I do? I immediately figured out, and I'm not particularly adept at this, but I figured out how the television set worked in our stateroom. We had no CNN. There was no CNN. There was MSNBC, which was a disaster. I've never seen a more poorly put together programming in my life. But what worked? Fox. And so many of you know I'm not a big fan of Fox. I've often said Fox and news is an oxymoron. But I listened to Fox in order to find out what was going on. The other thing I listened to was BBC. And BBC turned out to be the best. So would I miss an acceptance speech by a presidential candidate? So I woke up at 1:30 a.m. on the ship, turned on BBC, watched Adam Kinzinger, and then Kamala Harris's sister, and then the acceptance speech by Kamala Harris. I watched it and I listened with great care. And I realized a couple of things. I don't think anybody really watched the Democratic National Convention. When I was asked on the ship by people who wanted to know my opinion, I said, don't look for any bump. There will be no bump from the Republican convention, no bump from the Democratic convention. What I'm looking for tonight is some expression of a winner or a loser. Now, here's the next question you have to ask. Will it change any minds? When Richard Nixon ran for president in 1960, he made a strategic error. He ran a 50-state campaign. Richard Nixon is the only candidate for president of the United States to ever campaign in all 50 states between the convention and the election. He went to Alaska 2 days before the voting. Had he gone to Illinois, he might have won the presidency. But Nixon made a pledge and he kept it. We no longer have 50-state campaigns. You all know that we are going to watch 7 key states. That's what we're going to do. And the polling in the national polling doesn't matter. What matters is the individual states. And in Nebraska, 1 congressional district. Because in Nebraska, as in Maine, the electoral votes are assigned not by who carries the state, but who carries the congressional district. Let me point out that it was proposed in 1960 and previously by Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who was then a member of the Senate, that there be no electoral votes per se, but it be decided by congressional districts and how congressional districts voted. Had that happened, Nixon would have defeated Kennedy. He carried more congressional districts than Kennedy did. So how the structure of all of this is set up is critical. Now, I know the clock is ticking, but you have to give me a few more minutes because this is ridiculous. One of the things that came up over the weekend was Donald Trump's statement that the election is rigged. That if he loses, there is no way he would have lost in a legitimate election. By the way, don't believe me. That's why I'm assigning you the job of listening carefully to what the candidates say. Don't listen to what people say they say. Donald, because of pressure, he is now saying, well, he lost by a whisker. He didn't lose by a whisker, not by any stretch of the imagination. But do you understand that who votes on election day and where they vote is going to be critical? Why are Democrats and Republicans pumping money into Pennsylvania, which may be the most decisive state? It may be the determining state, and they know it. Wisconsin, Michigan, again, 2 critical states, Arizona, Nevada. These are states, did I say Wisconsin? All of these states, 7 of them, represent who will win and who will lose. Let me remind you that the Republican Party, the Republican candidates for president, have not won a majority of the popular vote since George W. Bush defeated John Kerry in 2004. In every other national election, the Democrats have prevailed. Now, some people have said, can't we do away with the Electoral College? The answer is no. And if you were from a small state, an inconsequential state, you wouldn't want the Electoral College eliminated because your only voice is in that small state. And let me tell you, these small states will make a difference perhaps in this election. One critical note, The Republicans have withdrawn essentially from the contest in New Hampshire. New Hampshire, which some viewed as a swing state, is now going to go for Harris. So what do I do every day? I look at the polls. I test where I think there are strengths and weaknesses. The nomination of Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, made great sense because he appeals to people in the Midwest. And am I okay?
You're good.
Good.
Turned on.
You know, it's if Richard Nixon had the staff of the Fromm. Now, I have to do one more thing before we are required to take the break. I want to address the question of Donald Trump's legal problems. We have never had a presidential candidate who faces 34 counts on an indictment. We have never had a candidate for president of the United States who has been proven guilty on a sexual harassment charge. He was not convicted of rape, but he was convicted of sexual abuse. We have never had a candidate for president of the United States who has been under indictment for his business practices and who still faces huge penalties. We have never had a president of the United States who has said, and this is important to me, that if he wins the election, he will go after his enemies. We have never had a former president or a president who has said he would weaponize his administration, the White House, and inevitably the Justice Department for political retribution and revenge. Now, does that matter to half of the American electorate? The answer is, at this point, no. Now, let me explain my relationship with Kamala Harris. I've known her since before she ran for political office. The first radio talk show she ever appeared on was mine. By the way, I have a beautiful handwritten letter from her telling me what a wonderful inauguration it was into that medium. She is a prosecutor. Those of you who watched her as district attorney and as attorney general, and indeed during her time in the Senate, know that she is an extremely effective prosecutor. So what we will see tonight, I believe, is Kamala Harris acting as a prosecutor against Donald Trump. Now, let me explain, she has her weaknesses. Those of you, she has had the Attorney General's office and as Vice President of the United States. That is not necessarily a bad thing, because the job of the leader of an office is to make sure that the people they're working with are working well. It doesn't excuse the fact that she is tough as nails. I want to say a word about, before this debate, about the fact that this will be referred to as the Biden-Harris administration. When the question of Afghanistan comes up, and those of you who watched the ceremony today in the House of Representatives know, Kamala Harris is only mentioned three times in this Republican report, but she is also on record as saying she was the last person in the room with Donald Trump, with Joe Biden, as the fiasco of America's ending in Afghanistan took place. That is what Donald Trump is going to pursue. He is going to pursue with full vigor the fact that as vice president, she was part of the policy. Now, I want to be clear about something. Some of you know that one of my expertises is the vice presidency of the United States. The only vice president of the United States who has ever been a decisive force in policy was Dick Cheney. Vice presidents have one person, one constituent to whom they are responsible, and that is to the President of the United States. A president can do what Lyndon Johnson did to Hubert Humphrey and send him to the doghouse, and Humphrey was silenced for a lot of the Johnson-Humphrey administration. I want to remind you of a question that was posed to Dwight Eisenhower in 1960. By the way, you can see it on film. A reporter asked President Eisenhower, can you think of an instance when Vice President Nixon made a difference or made policy during your 8 years together? And Eisenhower responded, if you give me a week, I might think of one. Now you're laughing. Ike laughed as he said it because the vice president does not make policy. Do you understand? The vice president, well, I always remember Thomas Riley Marshall, who reflected that a mother had two sons. One became vice president and the other went to sea, and neither one was ever heard from again. Or John Nance Garner, who remarked that the vice presidency is as useful as a bucket of warm, I leave it there. Or Harry Truman, who was vice president for all of 82 days, who said the vice presidency is about as useful as a cow's fifth teat. Now, I point this out because vice presidents don't make policy, but you will hear tonight President Trump refer to the Biden-Harris administration. Kamala Harris will embrace Joe Biden. There is no doubt about it. For good or for ill, it was the Biden-Harris administration. Okay. With deep regret and with a profound sense of my responsibility to all of you for a potty break, and by the way, Frank Canios is in the room. My son was in his kindergarten class, and so Frank, I want to acknowledge potty breaks on your behalf. Ladies and gentlemen, 10 minutes, not a minute more, and then your questions.
I hope you are on blood pressure medication. Come down, because I have to go see my cardiologist, but I'll follow up on the remainder online.
Thank you.
Totally confused about it. The floor based on. Do people answer
Yeah.
their phone?
I'll do it. Okay. All right. Splendid. How are you?
Tracy, when you leave here, are you actually going home?
Yes. My son is picking me up. Absolutely. 100%. What the hell? Oh, here it is. Wait 1 sec. I have to turn off the.
Check 1 2 check 1 2 check. Check 1 2 check 1 2. check. 1, 2, 1, 2, check 1, 2.
Period.
Check 1, 2, check. Move to the other one, the system. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I think. Yeah, or just listen to see if the extron. Okay. 'He will at some point. So it's not clear which. Correct. It's not ready yet. One, two, three, four. Hello, how are you? You could buy another one in the office. Yeah. Yeah, I think we have 2 colors left.
Herbert, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I think we have like blue and brown. Take a look. Yeah, Derek, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can. The sound is working okay. It sounds like.
What about now? Can you hear that?
Yep, I can still hear you.
I think that's the better one.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe we should try this, the Seaman system, and see if that times out like it
Sure.
did before. I'm gonna leave the microphone setting to the different one.
Okay, and I turned off the I I closed the internet, so there shouldn't be any of those notifications that they're hearing in the room. And that might be when it beeps, that might actually be too loud for the microphone. Does that make sense?
Sorry, I have a hard time hearing you with a lot of people in here. I'm gonna call you instead.
Okay.
Yeah. Careful going down, okay? Careful. But-
One minute, 1 minute. Please take your seats. 1 minute. Thank you. Is it okay? Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Thirty seconds. Can you announce that out in the hall? Yes. Yes. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if I can have your attention, please. First of all, many of you asked me questions during the break. It is not that I am rude. Well, maybe. It simply isn't fair. Everybody deserves to be able to hear all the questions and all the answers. I will do my best. So they are going to pass around the microphone. I ask if you are using it with a microphone, ask a question. Do not make a speech. That's my job. Now, I do have some written questions here, and I want to just deal with those very quickly. Why do you keep saying that nothing can be done about climate change? If it's hopeless, why should we even go on? What's the use? Your comment about this is a gut punch that makes everything else a non-issue. First of all, you're not dead till you're dead. Second of all, we have a long way to go before we really face the ultimate challenges. When saying that nothing can be done, what I want to indicate to you is there is nothing that will be said on the stage tonight which will offer a decisive answer. But you have an indication. When Donald Trump and the people around him dismiss climate change, dismiss the problem. And I can tell you, those of you who live here in Northern California, look at the dikes they're putting up in Foster City. Look at the precautions that are being taken along the Great Highway. Look at what's going on around us, or do what I did, go to Los Angeles over the weekend, because there is no doubt that there is something very different going on in terms of climate. When I say nothing can be done, do you expect a candidate for president of the United States or any president of the United States to wave a magic wand and eliminate a growing problem? The answer is no. But I do want to hear from them about their commitment to issues and concerns. By the way, the automobile industry, Michigan is going to be a critical state in this campaign. And Donald Trump is using an expression, drill, baby, drill. He may use it tonight because he's somewhat repetitive. And that was not meant as a pejorative statement. So I'm making you aware of that, and I want to do that. Okay, so let me take your questions. There's no. I will. Yes, sir. Question is, what are the limits on executive power? There are limits, most assuredly. But I remind you now that Bill Barr, who was the Attorney General of the United States during the closing days of the administration, and then resigned because of what Donald Trump was doing, understood clearly the limits. But let me explain to you that if, for instance, Donald Trump or Kamala Harris is elected president, who they choose as their attorney general will be critical. Now, a lot of people criticize Merrick Garland. There are limits to what an attorney general can do. But remember that Bill Barr provided the ability for Donald Trump to skate on what we all know was the report on his involvement or his campaign's involvement with the Russians. Even if there was no collusion, there was clearly a sincere effort by the Russians to elect Donald Trump. May I point out to you as well that that situation exists today, not just with Russia, but with China, with Iran, with North Korea, and with other players. I am not as technically adept as I might be, but I can assure you I am smart enough to see how artificial intelligence and ads being used in directed ways can make a difference. I am not an expert in that area. I won't pretend to be an expert in that area, but I will tell you that the Justice Department is actively looking into this question. So in the old days, politics was a lot simpler. I do want you to understand that. There were problems, you were able to solve them. There were issues of technical problems in elections, you were able to deal with them. But I would remind you, we have never had a situation where a candidate for president before the election is saying it will be a fraudulent election unless he wins. No, you're chuckling about it. But let me tell you, I deal with millions of people because of my podcast and because of my years on the radio. There are people who believe that with perfect faith. And when Donald Trump uses terms like, if I lose, there will be a bloodbath, now he modifies it to say he doesn't mean it literally. There are people who believe him. When he talks about pardoning January 6th insurrectionists, that's a serious matter. And one of the questions here is, does a president absolutely have the power of pardon? And the answer is yes. It is an unconditional power. Let me reverse this. Joe Biden may choose, even though he says he won't do it, to pardon or grant clemency to his son, Hunter, because the last thing he wants to see is his son in jail. And I say this, I was one of the few people on the radio who agreed that there were problems with Hunter Biden, who accepted you remember, those who were in my class, I talked about the fact the computer was probably legitimate. But it means a president has tremendous power. Next question. Yes.
If Trump loses the election, will his hijacking and influence on the Republican Party finally be exercised, and will it be returned to its normal roots?
The question is the Republican Party, if Trump loses. I am going to address that. I'm not going to address it today. I'm going to address it as the campaign goes forward, and particularly in the weeks before the election. May I tell you, there needs to be a struggle for the soul of the Republican Party, because we are a two-party system. If we had time, I would share with you John W. Davis's observations on party government in the United States, speeches he delivered in the 1920s, and Thomas E. Dewey, who talked about the two-party system in the 1950s. Read. It works. You saw with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who mounted a campaign. By the way, he's going to be on the Michigan ballot. He asked to be removed. Michigan won't remove him. There are many reasons for that. But the important thing is, a third-party candidate doesn't win elections. The last third-party candidate to be elected president was Abraham Lincoln in 1860. And that was when there were 4 viable candidates. I'm only suggesting to you, in the strongest possible terms, that this election will be decided by voter turnout. Who is motivated most to get to the polls? And in the swing states, in a state like Pennsylvania, which may be decisive in this election, how Pennsylvania votes in the Electoral College will be determined on the voter turnout on the ground. The Republicans have a problem. Donald Trump has discouraged absentee ballot voting, voting early in elections, because he believed on election night that he won the election based on the returns that came in from people who voted that day. And the Republican Party is at an internal struggle over this, because now Republican officials have to advocate for early voting. If they don't, they won't win. It is at odds with Donald Trump's perception. One last point. I don't want to go into too great a detail on the Republican Party, but on the ellipse on January 6th, Donald Trump Jr. said, this is no longer the Republican Party, it is the party of Donald Trump. If that is true, the nature of American politics is going to change profoundly, because you have to have in this country, in my judgment, a viable two-party system. Here in California, we don't have a two-party system. Really, we have a one-party system. And I regret the fact that the Republican Party is not viable. And that should concern us all. Next question. Yes.
But how would you advise her to handle Trump's misstatement of facts and why?
Okay, remember, this debate or joint appearance is 90 minutes. If you get hung up on responding to every inaccuracy, you're in trouble. What if I were advising people around Kamala Harris, which I am? What advice would I give? She has to be herself. She has to be direct. She has to be clear. And she can't get hung up on trivia. Kamala has a tendency to want to really explain things. This is not a time for thorough explanations. However, a legitimate criticism of Kamala Harris is that she has not sat for interviews, extensive interviews, thus far in the campaign. That will have to change. She's going to have to expose herself clearly to tough questioning. I have worked in many campaigns. There are very few people who I know who can, at the drop of a hat, respond to tough questions. I learned on talk radio how to respond briefly, decisively, and emphatically, whether you disagreed or agreed. One other quick comment along these lines. Most Americans have made up their mind. There is a very small group of voters in swing states, maybe under 100,000, who will decide this election. I am going to be watching carefully the ads. And as my grandmother of blessed memory would have said, what is the emphasis? The battle against Trump will not be waged in face-to-face debates. It will be waged in television ads and the opportunity to really hit back. Now, there's a question that I know is going to be asked. What role do vice presidential candidates discussion? We vote for a president. And even if a vice president makes a decisive error, take Dan Quayle in the debate with Lloyd Benson. I knew Jack Kennedy. You're no Jack Kennedy. It did not prevent Bush and Quayle from winning. Next question. Yes. Question is about the future of Israel. It is not the United States of America or any nation in the world which will secure the future of Israel. That will be done by Israelis. Israel is a vital, vibrant democracy, torn over this question of Hamas, facing, as I indicated earlier, a multi-front challenge to her existence. There is no other nation in the world whose very existence is challenged. Think about that for a minute. And so I have every confidence that whether it is Trump or Harris, the alliance between the United States and Israel will remain firm, vital, and vibrant. And I say that emphatically. There is no difference on that policy. Yes. The question is about the interview with Dana Bash. It was not a successful effort on Kamala Harris's part. I don't blame anybody because when somebody walked into my studio, I didn't listen to how they want it set up. I did it the way I want it because it's my show. And you have to understand that that is part of the world of television today. To call Fox News is an oxymoron. To call MSNBC fair and objective would be ridiculous. CNN, frankly, I have real problems with, although my old friend Wolf Blitzer remains, I think, pretty clear. Jake Tapper, who I like, has a bias that is clear in everything he says. We don't have a Walter Cronkite or a Chet Huntley David Brinkley or a Frank Reynolds or a Howard K. Smith. We don't have that kind of journalism anymore. And as I reflected with some friends today, this is the first time I will not be on a radio station live during the debate. We have no talk radio station live in San Francisco, the fourth largest market in the United States of America. You know, people walk up to me and they say, "Didn't you used to be John Rothman?" And if I told you the number of emails and people who stop me in the grocery store, anywhere, and say, "We miss you on the radio," it is not me that they should be missing. What they should be missing is the chance for a real dialogue and a discussion. And while it's true I do a podcast every single day, and we have a remarkable listenership around the political world with John Rothman, it's 10 minutes every day, weekday. And I do something on the Voice of San Francisco every weekday as well for 10 minutes on San Francisco politics. There is not the kind of interaction which I believe is so necessary. It's not just the candidates. It's those of us who care about politics, who want a place to talk. During the break, somebody said to me, "Couldn't you do this every day?" And the simple truth is, in the old days, the answer would have been yes, on the radio. And if you agree with me, you say so. And if you disagreed with me, you'd say so. And by God, that's what made it fun. I don't like people to agree with me when I'm on the radio. Denise Chandler is sitting here, and her late father, the beloved Ira Blue, and the yes, ma'am. Yes. The question is, I don't mean to cut you off, but they can't hear the dialogue. Question is about whether George W. Bush will take a stand. Yesterday, the Bush people issued a statement saying that President Bush no longer is involved in presidential politics, that he will not take a stand. If his grandfather, Prescott Bush, were alive, he would be ashamed of it. And I believe very sincerely that if George H.W. Bush were alive, a man I never voted for, a man for whom I had tremendous disagreements, he would have taken a stand. But understand, the toughest thing to do in politics is desert your base, to desert your home. Now, I had a great deal of respect for Bob Dole. Bob Dole was the only defeated candidate for president or nominee of the Republican Party who appeared at the last Republican National Convention in 2016. And he did it because he had been chairman of the Republican Party, because he grew up in the Republican Party. That's why I admire the Cheneys. And I repeat my recommendation. By the way, it's not just Dick Cheney's book, King of the Hill. It is Liz Cheney's book, Honor and Power, I think it's called, which is an absolute, if I were going to require you to read a book, it is the case against Donald Trump. And by the way, Adam Kinzinger has also spoken out. So going back to the question that was asked earlier about reforming the Republican Party, we'll get to that. But right now, I would not look for Bush. However, let me be clear. There are over 200 people who participated in the Bush administration and in the Reagan administration. And there are a few of us who were in the Nixon administration who are still standing, all of whom are supporting Kamala Harris. Vocally, actively, intentionally. And I think I can't wait to teach a course. Remember, some of you took my course on the Republican Party? I can't wait to do that class again at some point. Next question. Yes. Yeah. Question is about the restrictions on voter turnout, and on voting in a variety of states. And you may have heard that in Florida, there is another move to restrict voting. Same thing applies in Texas. It's shameful. Somebody asked me why I was so, what I think about people who are ignorant of voting. And I reminded people when I was at Washington High School, I had a civics teacher, Dick Castile, who got hold of the literacy test used in the South in the early 1960s. I scored almost 100%. I missed one question. What branch of Congress controls laws relating to piracy? Now, I want you to understand something. If I, as a high school student who was very informed, could not pass a literacy test or could have been disqualified for failing one question, that's how they prevented African Americans from voting. I am opposed to literacy tests. How a person votes is their own business, even if I disagree with them profoundly. But these restrictions the Republicans have put on, including voter ID, Voting Rights Act, and I was appalled. If Thurgood Marshall were alive, he'd be rolling over in his grave. So all I can tell you is when one considers what is the goal of winning an election, Murray Chotiner, who I knew very well, who was Richard Nixon's campaign manager in the 46 campaign against Voorhees and the 50 campaign against Helen Gahagan Douglas. I attended a conference with him and I asked a question. And I asked Murray, what does it take to win an election? And this is what he said. Attack, attack, attack. Donald Trump was trained by Roy Cohn. And let me explain, Roy Cohn was hired, he was an attorney. Those of you who don't know, he was Joe McCarthy's right-hand man in the Army McCarthy hearings and before that. Roy Cohn taught Donald and his father a lesson. If you are attacked, hit them back. That means if Democrats say that what Donald Trump is doing is an assault on democracy, turn it around and say what Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are doing is an assault on democracy. Make the charges equivalent, even if they aren't. And that is the tactic of Donald Trump. By the way, in all fairness, any candidate for political office, we're seeing it right now in the mayor's race, the kinds of attacks that are now coming forth from good, honorable, decent people. But what's the goal of a campaign? To win. And by the way, that applied to Democrats. John F. Kennedy in the West Virginia primary, remember how they attacked Hubert Humphrey for not having served in the military? And who did they bring down to do that? Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr., who was a hero in West Virginia. So his father was a hero. So that's the kind of thing I expect in politics. Next question. Yes.
Attempt to take over the democracy, were they effective?
The question is about congressional hearings. And let me talk about court cases for a moment. Donald Trump tried to subvert American democracy. Now, I'm not saying this as a partisan, it's a fact. And if Jack Smith is able to bring these cases to court, I have no doubt that Donald Trump will be convicted. Here's the problem. If Donald Trump is elected president, all federal charges will be dismissed because Donald Trump will instruct that they be dismissed. The greatest flaw or tragedy that I have seen in this election cycle is that Donald Trump has not had to stand in a courtroom to talk about January 6th. I mean, it's clear, it's evident. I hope you read the January 6th report. I hope you read Liz Cheney's book, because it is spelled out so clearly that even I can understand it. But the problem is, as we used to say, don't confuse people with the facts. I attended a dinner party with a group of people for whom I have the highest regard, who proceeded to defend Donald Trump. No logic that I could present, no argument, no matter how substantive, changed their mind. I left one thing out that I have to do before I let you go, and that is to talk about the border crisis. You all know that that will be central in tonight's debate. And Kamala Harris, they will say, was the border czar. She wasn't. She was assigned the task of going to 3 Latin American countries to try to secure their cooperation on border control. Please don't confuse them with the facts that the number of people crossing the border are down. Please don't confuse them with the fact, and it's a true fact, that more people are being returned to Central and South America than in any administration since Barack Obama, who was the deporter in chief. This is not a campaign, nor is any campaign a rational moment in time. And the job of Donald Trump tonight will be to land as many punches as effectively as he can, even if some of the things he says are not true. And I'm being polite in this, but the same thing applies to Kamala Harris. How aggressive should she be? I did a terrible thing. I'm going to keep you a couple of more minutes. How aggressive should a woman be in an argument or a debate? She is a woman. Despite Donald Trump saying she just discovered she was Black, she is a woman. She is a woman of color. She is a woman standing on a stage. I remember during the Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump joint appearance, do you remember where Donald Trump stood? He walked across the stage and loomed over her. That should not happen tonight. But I want you to know, and I have to close. I'm terribly sorry. I apologize profusely. Tonight we will watch. We should be meeting tomorrow in class. We are not. And believe me, I would stand here given the opportunity every single day and do this every single day. And I apologize. I have been so cursory in my ability to communicate so many issues, but I'm counting on the superior intelligence of Fromm students. By the way, that I say that because I know you're going to be doing evaluations, and I want to make sure I'm rehired. I'm saying this because one of the things I would implore you to do tonight and over the course of the next week is write down questions. Write down your concerns, and I will open the class next week with a question. Who won, Harris or Trump? I don't expect fair and objective analysis from most of you, but I want you to do what I am trying to do. Put away your personal prejudices. Think about it as if you were an undecided voter, and then tell me. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is our first class. We have 7 more Tuesdays together. We will have an 8th Tuesday after the election. We have a long way to go, high drama at every moment, and we will try to do it together. Thank you very much. Thank you.